It's joined with Naomi Gershoni from Tel Aviv University, who's right there. And I'm excited to be presenting this paper here because the most common piece of pushback we've gotten on this paper is that people don't use economic frameworks to make family decisions, or its close cousin, women don't respond to incentives. So I'm glad that here we can all start from the common ground that they do. Let me start by taking you back to a paper from Golden and Katz in 2002, which postulated that the introduction of birth control allowed women to make greater career investments, and that translated into schooling investments. Why? Well, because they otherwise would suffer from excess fertility when they didn't want to, and they would have to spend time raising their family and not be able to invest in their careers. So being able to delay fertility was important, has been shown to be important in women's wages and labor force participation, and in fact, a major factor of why we've seen a dramatic shift in women entering the labor force and earning higher wages and going to college. So I think this literature then establishes that there is some kind of a career-family trade-off. Because if there isn't a career-family trade-off, then you wouldn't have this technology being so important. If it was possible to raise your 8 kids at the same time as, working 80 hours a week at a law firm, that technology wouldn't have been important. But then, as women's career investments have grown over time, as women are, entering these professions that are at the top of the career ladder, those investments that are required become lengthier and lengthier. So now it's not just about going to college, which takes, 4 years when you're 18, but it's about going to law school, which is, 4 years starting at maybe 22, and then doing the partner track at a law firm, or it's getting a PhD and then going on the tenure track, or getting an MD and then doing a surgical residency, right? So these things really start to push into the time when you would want to be having children. And what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is that women have this key biological difference from men in their fertility, which is that it drops off steeply later in life as women approach and pass 40. And this is a true biological asymmetry. So for men, the reproductive system ages at the same rate as other bodily systems, whereas for women, there's this separate aging process for the reproductive system. This is fertility over time, and this is the miscarriage rate with age. There's this separate drop-off. Where do you want me to move?
Can't see.
Oh. You want me to stand here? Yeah. Is this better for you? Okay.
Or at least move about.
So for women, there's this separate drop-off. And so that creates an additional cost of investment to women in terms of potentially not being able to achieve their own desired fertility. So if they take advantage of that earlier technology that we talked about, the technology to delay fertility, and then they delay too far, they might not be able to reach their own desired fertility. But it also might be seen as a negative through their partner's eyes. If they go on the marriage market when they're older, then the partner also knows he's going to have trouble achieving that desired fertility. And so that's what I call depreciating reproductive capital in my earlier work. So what I want to show you quickly is what the implications of that are in a theoretical model. The paper I'm going to present today is not going to have theory. It's going to be a test of the theory. So this is a simulation from my job market paper, which is about reproductive capital. And the idea is that the size of that decline, the precise amount that your fertility is lower if you make an investment first rather than having children right away, is going to matter for 2 things. 1, women's career investments, meaning their education, and 2, for their marriage market outcomes. So let me explain these pictures. As we go from here to here to here to here, P, which is the probability of being able to have the family size you want to have after a career investment, is increasing, okay? Dark blue dots mean that women have gotten educated or made a career investment, whereas light blue dots are women who have chosen not to make an investment. So when P is very small, this is the probability being 0.1 of being able to successfully have the family size you want to have after an investment. No women invest, okay? So we have all these light blue dots. And what the upward sloping diagonal line shows is that we have positive assortative matching. No women invest. And so women match positively, assortatively according to their skill and their husband's income, okay? if P grows a little bit, now it's 0.3 probability of having a family that you want to have after an investment, we see some women at the very top of the skill distribution change to dark blue, meaning they make an investment, but they don't get the same marriage outcome that they used to get. Why? Because now they're older on the marriage market and they've decided they're willing to pay that cost for the income that they get, but their spouses have plenty of their own income and actually prefer to match with these young and still fertile women who are just a little bit less skilled than the women who've made the investment. So these women have made the investment but end up matching down here instead of up here where they used to match, okay? As P continues to grow, we see that more dark blue dots, more women making the investment, and we see that segment kind of sliding up the matching distribution because now it's not so bad. This is, the probability is 0.5. It's not so bad to try to have a family after you've invested. And so men on the marriage market are also not penalizing them as much, and so they're matching a little bit better. And as P continues to grow, we see that we can begin to return to positive assortative matching, and the extreme would be that if P was 1, of course you would have positive assortative matching and you would have everybody invest, okay? So that's the theoretical prediction, which is that if the probability of being able to achieve the family size you want to have later in life is higher, we're going to have more women making career investments, and the marriage market outcomes for those women who do invest are going to be better. Instead of being penalized for that investment, they might be rewarded for the additional income that it brings. So what we're going to do today is try to look at a natural experiment on that later life fertility. So we've established this depreciating reproductive capital could lead to problems on the marriage market and therefore influence human capital investments. In my job market paper, I used an experiment to estimate the size of this and found that for a woman who's a year older, between 30 and 40, she has to make an extra $7,000 to be treated equally on the dating market. So that's sort of the price of the biological clock. So to test this hypothesis, you ideally want an instrument for later life fertility. I'd like to randomly assign some women to be able to conceive until they're 45 and other women to not, and see how their career investments differ, to see if that's actually the reason women are kind of worried about making career investments, and see if their marriage market outcomes are different, okay? Yeah?
What about the length of, increase in the length of life in this whole syndrome? So women can actually give birth early and study later and have a career. This is also possible.
Yeah, so that's one of the ways I think people are breaking out of this cycle, but it's actually highly penalized. So right now, people really believe that you have a lot of human capital depreciation, and so you'll see that wages go down a lot if people get their degree and then don't make that investment right away. Instead, they have a family and then go back to make that investment. You see wages drop down a lot and not recover. So I think that is exactly one of the potential solutions, is saying, do all of these investments need to be stacked together right during these reproductive years? But I think we're not there in the labor market. So unfortunately, it's hard for me to randomly assign women's fertility. So what I'm going to look at instead is that we have one technology, the pill, that allowed women to avoid excess fertility. Well, there's another technology that allows women to avoid a shortage of fertility, which is in vitro fertilization. So Israel in 1994 made in vitro fertilization completely free for their population. And so we're going to use that as a natural experiment to test the theory-driven predictions that extended reproductive horizons should increase career investments and improve marriage market outcomes for older women. So based on the theory, our three predictions are that when you have access to IVF, whereas you didn't before, and so now it's easier to have children later in life, you're going to delay marriage, use that time to make career investments, and then those women who do make those investments and choose to marry when they're older are no longer going to be penalized on the marriage market, so they're going to match with higher income men than they did previously. We're going to use a difference in differences estimation using the 2008 Israeli population census. So to tell you what I'm going to do today, I'm going to first give you some of the background in the literature, talk about our data, and then I'm going to give you our results. And after I do that, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about alternative explanations for our results, because one of the challenges we're facing here is that this was a nationwide policy change, and so we really only have that time variation. And so I'm going to do a lot of extra work to try to convince you that what we see is really coming from the fact that in vitro fertilization was made free. Yes?
So feel free to differ, it's maybe from your earlier work, but why does it do they have to delay marriage? So they could still marry early and just delay fertility, right?
Yeah, so in most models, the main benefit of marriage is through sharing public goods, and one of the main public goods is children. And so if you're not going to have children yet, it kind of doesn't necessarily make sense to get married because you could be sort of enjoying your single life. But it doesn't, so that's actually what we see in the data, is that people in general have children very quickly after they get married. If we wanted to model it differently, which is that they got married first, that would be completely fine, and it would just be about when's the onset of childbearing. But in reality, in the data, they move together, and it's going to be easier for me to measure age at marriage than age at first birth. Yeah?
In Israel, so did they make this free or also other infertility treatments?
So in 1994, IVF was very new, and so there weren't that many other ones, but it was free assisted reproduction technology, whatever was available at the time. As time has gone on, that technology, that suite of technology has grown, and there's more and more technologies available, like egg freezing and surrogacy and stuff like that, that wasn't around in 94. But it was...
Thinking of the easier one that is like artificial insemination.
Yeah, so it's all, exactly. So it's all in all ART technology.
All free.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to just very quickly tell you about the prior literature, because other people have looked at IVF, but they've done it using state year insurance variation and insurance mandates. So different states in the US require that insurers cover different amounts of assisted reproduction technology. The problem with that is that I want to look at the effects not on the women who actually use the technology, but I want to look at the effects on young women who know that the technology is available to them and are going to make their decisions taking into account that rate of depreciation of reproductive capital, and on their potential partners. And I just don't believe that, men on the marriage market are looking up their state's insurance code to understand exactly how fertile their potential bride is. So that's why I think you really need this sort of countrywide big shift to look at the effects not on the women who use it, that's been done, but the effect of it being a type of insurance against later life infertility. So let me tell you a little bit about the policy. The policy is for all ART technologies, including IVF. I kind of just shorten it to IVF because that's the most well known. What's incredible about this funding is that the funding was for unlimited access to ART technology for up to 2 take-home babies, meaning the funding wasn't provided based on the number of cycles, it wasn't provided based on the number of dollars, it was provided on the actual outcome that you get to take 2 babies home, which means that's the most generous funding of IVF anywhere in the world. You will never find an insurer any place that provides that level of funding. It's also enormously expensive. Why would Israel want to do this? Well, to them, it was part of a set of pro-natalist policies. They wanted their population to have more children. Usage increased dramatically. Israel became a world leader in IVF, and today 4% of the babies in Israel are conceived via IVF, which is an enormous number compared to the next down country. Okay, but they think it's going to help women who are 35 to 40 actually increase their fertility. But it's also a type of insurance against this later life infertility. So we know that how are people going to respond to insurance? They're not just going to respond to it when they get to the age that they need it. They're going to respond to it earlier in life, right? And so in fact, the fertility effects may not be positive coming out of this because women are going to delay marriage, right? So how do we think about this treatment? I think it's important that we don't think that and the people who are in our treated cohort sort of read the news and are like, now I have access to IVF, I'm going to go to college, okay? The way we think about it is that we think prior to this, it was a very new technology and very few women were having births sort of after, let's say, age 38 or age 40, okay? So most women went into making their educational decisions with the view that it was very difficult to have a family later in life and that starting a family later in life would expose them to the risk of not having a child or not having the family size they wanted to have. After this technology change, we think that there started to be a gradual shift in those beliefs, right? Sort of those expectations of your future ability to conceive, both from direct knowledge of the technology, but also from the fact that suddenly your cousin is having a child at age 40 and you start to see that this is something that's possible, okay? So we're not going to necessarily be looking for like an RD type discontinuity. I think that would be a little bit unbelievable. What we're going to look for instead is a trend break where that kind of builds up over time. Okay, so to show you the policy change on usage, so this is when the policy was passed, 1994, and this is IVF's impact on live births, and so this is 94, it takes some time to make a baby, so here in 95 we see a lot more births with IVF technology. And also, because we're estimating off of the perception shift, it's important that I show you that the perception actually did shift. And in fact, many people believe the perception shifted too far, that people were actually overly confident about the technology, kind of thought it was a miracle technology and anything was possible with it. So these are students' guesses of how easy it is to have a birth with IVF. When they're looking between age 20 to 39, their guesses are pretty accurate towards the medical data. But when you start going after age 40, they think it's like 30% chance with IVF you can have a baby, whereas the medical data tells us it's only a 20% chance. So the perceptions actually may have shifted a little too far. And we think, part of what drove that is there was a lot of media coverage, both of the policy, there was a debate about whether it should be passed and whether it was too expensive, et cetera, and then of the resulting births. Sometimes in the US you see in the tabloids like 60-year-old mom gives birth to triplets, right? So there was a lot of positive coverage of the births resulting from this technology. Yeah?
But shouldn't there be a difference between what their expectations are about themselves and
the
actual medical data of people who had problems? Because they don't have any problems, they're just going to delay.
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah, so that's right. So they may be justified and they also might be saying, by the time I get to that age, the technology is going to be better or something like that. Yeah. So let me talk about the data. We used the 2008 Israeli population census, and it's a 20% sample of Israeli households. Then we also use some additional sort of administrative data and macro data to try to validate our results. We do the analysis for Israeli-born Jews. So Israel is not a homogenous country. There's sort of the majority Jewish population. There's an Arab minority. And then there's also a lot of immigrants from the Soviet Union who come in during the 80s. And so we kind of wanted to get all of that out of our data. The results are robust to using the full sample. And one way that helps us is we think the Arab population, which has much lower education overall, might not be as responsive to the policy change. And so at the end, I'm going to show you kind of using them as a falsification test to show you that they don't respond. So in some of our specifications, we're going to be using men as the counterfactual for women. So I kind of wanted to show you the difference between men and women. All of this is going to go into a fixed effect, so we don't really care that they start out with different educational levels and stuff like that. But we do care if their time trends are different. And so where we see that the time trends in our key outcomes are actually different, we're going to put in a group-specific time trend into the difference in difference specification. Yeah.
Why do you think the men should respond at all?
Yeah, so in equilibrium, if women marry different people, men also have to marry different people, right? So I think that it's not that the men aren't going to respond at all. I think it's that the response is going to be very different. So as far as the educational response, I think, they might respond to women getting more education by eventually getting more education themselves, but certainly the response is going to be later and less substantial. Is there a question back there?
One of the concerns that I don't know if you get to that is what will happen to the children
when they have older mothers.
And without
Yeah, so I'm going to be agnostic about whether this is a good or a bad thing. What I'm trying to do is use it as a tool to test whether reproductive capital is actually important in the first place, right? And then we can think about the right policies for addressing it. I'm not sure this is the right policy, nor am I sure that companies paying for women to freeze their eggs is the right solution to the problem. Okay, so the outcomes we analyze are going to be college education, graduate education, age at first marriage, and spousal income based on when you marry. We're going to use a D&D. So for education and marriage age outcomes, men are going to be our kind of counterfactual group because we're postulating that they're not going to respond. And we are going to put group-specific time trends in there where needed to allow for the fact that we know women over time have been becoming more educated. For the marriage market outcomes for your spouse's income based on when you marry, there we can use the comparison between women who marry when they're after 30 to women who marry before 30, because what we're looking at is, does it help older women's marriage outcomes? And then if we want to use men, we can do a triple difference specification where we then bring men in. I kind of talked about this, but the key identifying assumption of typical D&Ds is that you have parallel trends. We're going to allow for differential trends where it's warranted by the pre-term data, where it shows that there are differential trends. But for us, because we're looking all at one country, we need to assume there's nothing else in 1994 creating a trend break for the treated group, right? And so that's where we're going to do a lot of work later to try to show you that we don't think that this is something, some other policy that really helped women starting in 1994. And then that's going to include looking at the Arab population, where we can do the same male and female comparison and show that, for them, women don't have this discontinuous trend. As far as who's treated, for age at first marriage and other marriage outcomes, it's going to be really easy. It's going to be anybody who marries after 1994 who's treated. For college and graduate school, it's kind of tricky to say who's treated, because who you want are the people who are entering that level of school or making that schooling decision in 1994, right? So then you have to count backwards to figure out which birth cohort is treated. And in the US, it's fairly homogenous that people start college at 18. In Israel, unfortunately, there's a little bit more of a spread because people go into the army and do other things. Also, one thing to quickly note, people start college much later in Israel. So in the US, again, people start at 18. In Israel, they start at a median age of 23. That's important because it's why we even look at college as an outcome, because if it were the US, I don't think college really cuts into your marriage and family bearing years. But in Israel, where people marry on average at age 24 and start childbearing right away, actually, deciding to go to college at 23 does start cutting into that time.
So,
yeah.
Women have the same military service obligations.
Women do 2 years and men do 3, right? On average. There's some heterogeneity there. And so later we're going to, because we use men as a control group, we're going to look at what if we shift men to sort of map onto when women enter college. Okay, so these are the equations that we just talked about. So
is there an alternative? I mean, aren't you worried that people might latch on to the thing about, about men responding or not? And is there perhaps a way of combining your different diffs approach with a slightly more structural approach that will factor in how much one might expect men to respond?
Yeah,
even as an accounting identity?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So I think I can use my earlier work to kind of see what the equilibrium effects are on men. Yeah.
Almost bound.
Yeah. Okay. So these are the equations. So, it's a standard difference in difference, where what you want to look at is the interaction between being in the post period and being in the treated group. The treated group is going to either be that you're female or that you're older at the time of marriage, depending on what we're talking about. And then, in addition to that standard D&D, we're going to do a D&D that allows for discontinuous trends, because basically, as I'm going to show you in the graphs in a second, what we see is that it's not, like a jump like that, but rather it's sort of like a trend break where the outcomes continue to evolve over time as the use of the technology spreads. So what we're going to do is then not just have a, treated times post, but treated times time times post, and then all the other interactions of the time trends in there to account for everything else, okay? So let me show you the first result graph, because I think it's going to make it a lot clearer sort of what the estimation exercises that we're doing. Yeah?
A really good way of testing this would actually be to do a test for where the structural break is.
Yes, we do that. I'll show it to you. So, okay. So this is the results for marriage age. And so this is the difference between women's age at first marriage minus male age at first marriage. So all the numbers are negative. And here's the pre-period leading up to 1994. And in 1994, you see it kind of pops up. And then it has this different trend after 1994, where women's age at first marriage continues to get older and older. And what it's kind of a bummer that Israel doesn't have a bunch of states where we could do like a state year thing, but what I like about the fact that it's sort of one country is that I can plot it and show you really clearly what's going on, unlike the state year diff and diffs where you kind of don't quite know where the identification is coming from. Here it's very clear that, we see these dots jump up, and so when I show you the regression, there's sort of no funny business going on. And so in the regression, what we see, if we do, yeah?
So in the picture there, shouldn't you expect just a shift instead of a new change in the slope?
Yeah, so why I think we get this is because I think there's a couple things going on. One is that knowledge of the technology spreads. So there's some people who learn about it because they read the newspaper about the actual, you know, the law being passed, right? But then there's other people who see Aunt Kate have a baby at 42, and that's this woman. And then these people are, you know, out there in the population having children older, right? And you see, so that grows. The other thing is the technology is also improving, and we definitely see usage continue to grow over this period. And then the last thing, which I think is important for when we think about the magnitude of the effects, is that I don't think it's just that all of this is necessarily coming from IVF, but I do think the introduction of IVF initiated a trend break, which then builds on itself. So suddenly women in society are getting married later, and then that becomes the thing that you see other people doing, and so you're more willing to do it. Okay, so in the regression we see that in the standard D&D, which is always going to be the first 3 columns, we see that fem times post has an effect size of about 1/3 of a year. So women are marrying on average about 1/3 of a year later. And then when we do this discontinuous time trend, you see most of it is coming from the shift in the slope rather than, you know, a shift in the intercept. Okay? And, you know, the different columns basically just add on fixed effects and then clustered standard errors. So this is college education.
Clustered?
What?
What are the clusters?
Clustered at the year of marriage level. We can't do a regional cluster because we only have one. So this is college education, and so this is college attainment, and here what we're doing is treated is 1971 using that median age of college entry of 23. Oh my God, I have 15 minutes. So using the median age of college entry of 23, but I just want to show you, you know, like we think it might be a little fuzzy around there, but you can also really see that if you put these bounds around that these people, some percentage of them might have been treated, it kind of looks like that hockey stick shape you would want to see of the gradual evolution to the new trend. That's also significant in regression. I'm actually going to go pretty quickly through these results since I have so little time because I want to show you guys the kind of robustness tests where we try to make sure that this is what's going on. The other thing that we've done is rather than using 1971 as post, is we've taken a percentage of each cohort that was entering college in 1994 and used that as sort of a continuous measure of treatment, and we've done the same effects like that and everything holds up. Graduate education, here's the picture. Here's the sort of, you know, picture with the bounds on it. Here's the regression. So again, the same sort of thing, same story where we see this strong fem times post, but most of it's coming through a change in slope when we allow the slope to change as well. And then we also show that graduate education conditional on college changes. So it's not just that more women are going to graduate school because we just increase the supply of women going to college, but conditional on college, more women are choosing to go to graduate school. Okay, so let me quickly show you the spousal.
Information on majors because for, you know,
I don't, yeah, but I would love to.
For some occupations, this matters much more than
absolutely, because the question is, which occupations are you expecting a second term of investment following this? And we'd want to see an increase in that, and I don't have that. I think graduate education is a good signal of that, though, because in general, yeah, that's a career path rather than college, which can be something else. Okay. So here's the results on spousal income. We think you have to be really careful because we're using retrospective data, and so we're looking at everybody in 2008 and then looking in the past. You have to be really careful to control for age here, but I wanted to first give you the raw numbers so you can kind of see what the size of the effect is, which is that if you married when you were between 30 and 35, rather than 25 to 30, you used to marry a poorer spouse, and after the change, that penalty appears to go away. So, you know, sort of on average, it's a 30,000 shekel change. So this is like a $8,000 change from your spouse's income that you're going to get from marrying after 30. Marrying after 30 in Israel during our pre-period was extremely rare, and then it became more common in the post-period. Okay, and then, so as I said, we have to be really careful to control for spouse's age. So this is where we take the spouse's income for age percentile. So are you getting a 98th percentile man or a 95th percentile man? And we also see significant effects there. And now a couple other ways we look at spousal income. We do a bunch of controls for women's education, income, and age to show that even if the woman is the same quality, she's still getting a higher quality man after the policy change when she marries older. We do a triple difference specification, doing the difference with men, because this was the older minus younger women difference. Then we also use spousal education as an outcome. So are you getting a college-educated spouse or a graduate-educated spouse? That's significant. But then we do a Mincer regression to get unobservable quality, the residual after you regress income on education and age and a bunch of other things. So not only do you get a more educated spouse, but controlling for his education and his observables, you get a better unobservable, a higher unobservable quality spouse as well. And we have some preliminary results on divorce that I'm not going to show you today, but basically the remarriage market for women gets better as well, because women who want to get remarried are older, and that remarriage market gets much more favorable, and that they appear to be able to remarry at much higher rates after the policy change. So now what I want to do is dig into, is this actually from this IVF policy change, okay? The first thing I want you to remember is that we were theory-driven in how we approached this. So it's not that somebody showed me data of Israel and said, look, something happened in 1994, and then I was like, what happened? Okay, I had this hypothesis about reproductive capital, found a country that had a policy change, and when we looked at it, everything went in the direction that the model predicted. And I could have found something different. It could have, these things could have gone down, or there could have been no change in them. Yeah, Nazi.
Any decline in divorce? Because these people potentially now can time their fertility better, matching is getting better.
Yeah.
Because you talk about remarriage, but divorce itself should decline maybe.
Yeah, it's hard to say because if women's outside option goes up, then they might want to divorce more because they can get out of bad marriages that formed, they were penalized before and now the remarriage market gets better. So that's why we're like a little cautious on the divorce stuff, but we'll look at it. Yeah.
Of the world, but what's the probability? So what's the fraction of people that is married in your sample is 100%, 99%, 98%? Because does this have an impact on the probability of being married?
So I didn't put it in here, but what we showed is that when these women delay marriage, they don't forego marriage. That by the time you get to like 35, marriage rates have gone back up to so it's like, you see the distribution shift down, but then it recovers. Yeah. Okay, so let's dig into, what could have been potential alternative explanation. So the first thing that we worried about is with big sample D&Ds, you just worry that you have too much power, and basically any place you draw the line, it's going to look like there was a change because you just have so much data that you're going to get stars kind of no matter what you do. So we wanted to first check that you couldn't throw a policy change anywhere and come out with significant results, especially because things that we're looking at, like women's education, are kind of changing over time. So to rule this out, we produced placebo tests. First, we use the United States with a treatment of 1994, and we show, and I'm not going to show it to you because I don't have time, that those graphs are really pretty flat and they're not significant in a regression. So if we just say, what if we did the same thing with the US in 1994, we don't see this magnitude of effect at all. Then we also use education outcomes for a bunch of other countries. So we don't have marriage data for a lot of other countries, but we go on IPOMs and basically get all the different censuses and throw in a 1994 policy change and show that you never see a shift in college education or graduate education of this magnitude. Then we perform another type of test, which I was asked for in the back, which searches for a trend break over all possible years. The test I use is a quant likelihood ratio test. It basically puts a trend break in every year, takes the F-test of that trend break actually being there, and then you find the maximum F-test and then check if it's still significant with a really high critical value because you've run a whole bunch of tests. When we do that, we find that for age at first marriage, the maximum F-stat is at 1994, and for college education, the maximum F-stat is at 1971, which is the year of our trend break. And so this was the test, I think, for me and my co-author, where we were like, okay, we believe it, because we searched all the possible years there could have been a break, and it came back as the year of the policy change. Okay, another thing we worried about. Yes, that's significant. So the critical values are down here. It's 5.86 with the number of years we test. This is 7.68. This is 24.8. So the next thing we worried about is that because we're using 2008 data and looking at all these effects retrospectively, there could be some censoring that happens in the data or something weird that happens as people age that kind of mechanically creates these differences between men and women. So we worried about this especially for education because men seem to start their education later and then also take longer to finish because they're not worried about the ticking clock. And so as you look at later birth cohorts, they might have less education, but it could be because they haven't finished it yet and and not because they're actually going to achieve less education in their lifetimes. So what we do to deal with this is first we shift men's cohort year to account for their longer military service, and so we use a later group of men as controls, and our results are robust. Then we also have a separate longitudinal data set that has a lower sample size and has fewer years, which is why we don't use it for the whole thing. But because it's longitudinal, it's not going to have this censoring issue. We can look at the same age men in every year. And what we see there, and I think it looks really nice, the blue dots are women and the red triangles are men. And what you see is that the women pop up and the men really have a constant trend. The men aren't changing. So it's not driven by something weird going on with the men. It's really driven by this cohort of women getting more education. What's strange is that for some reason when we switch to this data, it looks like the 1970 cohort is treated, not the 1971 cohort. I have no explanation for that, but it's a different data set and it's measured at a different time in a different way. So, yeah.
But I think in the trend break, it was also that the 1993 was already significant, no? So maybe there was some...
Oh. In the QLR. So yeah, there may have been some media coverage ahead of time or something. So, okay, and then the last thing that we do is that we use the 95 Israeli census, because then you're going to be doing the same retrospective analysis, right? So we look backwards at all these outcomes in 95, pretending there was a 1981 policy change. And what we find is that it's not from censoring, it's not from retrospective analysis. You know, when we look in 95, and I can show it to you, we don't see any of those same breaks. Everything looks pretty straight except for age at first marriage, which, oops, oh no. I'm never going to get back to where I was. Except for age at first marriage, which goes the other direction. So we don't think that there is sort of, it's censoring that's driving this. Okay, so then the last thing, which is good, is whether there are other policy changes at the same time. So the first thing was that when they, unfortunately, legislators never just pass one law at the same time, which is a real bummer for people who like to do D&Ds. Unfortunately, they like to get several things done during the legislative session. So there were some other health expansions at the same time in terms of healthcare coverage. We don't expect this to have gender differential effects. And if anything, given that you're going to have more healthcare coverage through the government, we would expect that to lower educational and career investments because you have less need to provide your own healthcare. The second thing is that during this period in Israel, they were taking like technical colleges, like technical institutes where people would get like 2-year associate degrees and bringing them into the academic world, academizing them. And so, you know, we wondered whether, first of all, is there just a semantic shift that women who used to be getting something that wasn't called a college degree are now getting something that's called a college degree. We rule that out by showing that our effects are exactly the same if we look at any post-high school education. So, you know, if we count those technical degrees, our effects are still the same. Second of all, actually, the technical colleges largely served men, and so we expect that to actually increase male education more than female education. And then lastly, colleges, these technical colleges, appeal usually to people in the more peripheral areas and the not our sample. So our biggest impact is for Israeli-born Jews. The people who generally are served by these technical colleges are not that. So what we do to look at that and to also rule out that it was any other 1994 policy change that differentially affected women but not men is that we look at the Arab population. Why do we think the Arab population is a good control? Well, because we don't expect them to be at the margin of making a large career investment. This is a group where the rates of college education are much lower, the age at marriage is much younger, and the age at first birth is much younger. And so if you're not at the margin of deciding to go become a lawyer or go become a doctor, this policy change is going to be much less meaningful for you. But at the same time, the policy change of technical institutes becoming academic universities, and if that's really appealing, that's going to actually really target this group where that's sort of the modal level of education that you get. So, oh, I don't have to go there. I have it here. Yeah, so when we look at the Arab population, we see, in general, pretty straight lines, except for age at first marriage, which is going the other direction rather than going up. And so this, we think, is pretty strong evidence because this is doing the same female minus male difference. So there's not some other 1994 policy change that helps all women in Israel because we don't see any changes for women in this Arab population living in Israel. Questions? Okay. Yes, so we ended up not putting them in here because there's some problems with but we have looked at the orthodox sample that we can identify is pretty small because we can't actually use orthodox. We have to use the stand-in of whether anybody in your household has gone to yeshiva. So we have a pretty small sample, and then when we collapsed it to women marrying after age 30, we basically had empty cells all over the place. So we have to rethink it a little bit, but we're going to do the orthodox population as well. And what we do have shows that same thing where it looks pretty straight. So I'm just going to close by showing you some quick pictures, which is that we also just wanted to make sure that, it wasn't a larger societal trend, that it really was something that happened in 1994, and thus from this policy change. And so what's trendy in difference and differences analysis is to do something called an event study analysis. What that is you basically put every possible treatment effect into one regression. So the QLR was different. The QLR takes each year at a time and tests if it's significant. The event study puts all the possible treatment effects in, and then you graph the coefficients. This is super demanding of your data, so they frequently come out looking really messy. Anybody who's done this before knows that. What we do is a distributed lag analysis, which looks at the impact of being at or greater than a certain year, okay? And we do that because we see that effect evolve over time rather than just be a one-time change. So these are the graphs from our event study analysis. Time 0 is the year of our policy change, and what you see is that when we graph the coefficients with all of these coefficients in one regression, only time 0 comes out as significant. Remember, this is at or after that year, so it captures the fact that you kind of continue to see an impact after that. This is age at first marriage. This is college education. Again, right there in year 0, the year of the policy change, is where you actually see a significant effect. This is graduate education. This one's significant. This one's not significant, but it's kind of up there. Our kind of hypothesis is that you see an impact at the treated cohort, but also once the people who were induced to go into college start entering graduate school. So there are people making their graduate school decision, and then there's this second wave from the more people going into college. And then I have to show you one that looks terrible, so you know I didn't cook the data. This is spousal income, and it looks awful. But the other three really came out really strongly showing that change exactly in 1994. So I think we show that following the introduction of in vitro fertilization, women married later and gained more education. And these women that did do that and therefore married older were penalized less on the marriage market. It's important in interpreting these results that we remember that they were predicted by theory, and therefore that can help determine how much we let it kind of move our priors. But this work suggests that the beneficiary population for things like free IVF might extend far beyond the women who actually use it, and that the insurance effect might be very important. So then, furthermore, taking that further, the biological fertility asymmetry might be an important force in explaining divergent economic outcomes, because when we do something to get rid of it, we see that things change quite a bit. So, thank you. Yes.
Differential fertility between college and non-college educated women. But my calculation, I'd say from 2000 2005 on.
Differential fertility.
35 and above.
Yeah, so that would be the direct effect on the women who actually use the technology, right? Yeah.